So in the last video, we covered a very large group, the mollusks, and this video is also going to cover a very large, diverse group, the annelid worms. So these are the animals we've covered thus far. We're now in the protostome clade. We're in a specific clade called the Lophotrochozoa. In general, members of these clades have either a lophophore feeding structure or a trochozoan larva. And this is true, at least the latter of these is true of the mollusks and the annelids. They do have a trochophore larva. We haven't really talked about the lophophore. It's in animal groups that we really aren't covering in this course, so you don't have to worry about that. But we are in the last major lineage in this group, the annelids. Now the annelids, two of the synapomorphies that they have that's very important, and we'll talk about their functions, are setae and parapodia. As I mentioned, it's a very diverse group, over 20,000 recognized species. There are two main clades, and their names sort of refer to characteristics of them, but it's kind of legacy names because of reorganization or a better understanding of the phylogenetic relationships. The first name actually is a little bit better, the Aurantia. These are relatively mobile benthic surface worms. Some of them are burrowers. Some of them are commensals and parasites as well, but they in general are moving, and that's what an errant worm is. Errant means moving. But by far the largest clade is the clade, the Sedentaria. So this implies that these are sedentary worms that aren't moving. And most of these are marine burrowers or tube dwellers, so they are sessile, but it does include some of the mobile groups that you're most familiar with, the earthworms and the leeches. So this is the name that really isn't quite as appropriate as it used to be. These are bilaterally symmetrical triploblastic eucoelomate animals, and as you might imagine, their cephalization varies depending upon their movement patterns. So those that are more errant definitely do have good cephalization. The burrowers that are more sessile and the tube dwellers that are sessile have less cephalization. In general, though, particularly if you look at the errant forms, they have three basic body segments. They are regions. They have the head right here in this organism. So little extension structures here are called parapodia. The region in front of that is the head. Where you start seeing these parapodia, these segments refer to the trunk. And the trunk, because it is found in segments, we call this metamerism. Metamerism is serial repetition of structures in multiple segments. That's why these are called the segmented worm. Each of these segments specifically is called a metamere or a somite. So that makes up the bulk of the body, but the very last segment where we see the anus, that is the segment that is called the pygidium. The epithelium is covered by a thin outer cuticle that's actually secreted by the epithelium, by the epidermis itself, and most annelids have these bristly spines extending from their body, which are called setae. They're chitinous bristles. Chitin is a specific polysaccharide complex sugar that makes up these structures. And there are usually setae in annelid worms. In some cases, lots of setae. In other cases, not very many. But there have been completely lost in one group, the leeches. Annelid worms don't have a rigid skeleton. Their skeletal support is controlled by a hydrostatic pressure that is primarily related to the pressure, the hydrostatic pressure in the well-developed coelomic cavities. Remember, these are eucoelomates. So the amount of fluid in these cavities helps to regulate the pressure, but also this can be regulated by the circular muscles that are surrounding this coelomic cavity. Now, each of the somites has its own pair of coelomic cavities that are separated by the gut and the mesenteries that are connecting the gut to the mesoderm lining the walls of the coelomic cavity. In addition, there are septa between the individual somites or metameres that are maintaining separation between individual coelomic cavities. Now, the side structures that we see here, the parapodia, that literally means false feet or sort of feet. Para means kind of something that's kind of sort of. So it's kind of a foot-like extension of the body. You can see in species that have large parapodia these support rods, which are just really greatly enlarged setae. But that's about it for a rigid skeletal support. They do have a very well-developed muscular system with distinct layers of circular and longitudinal muscles in each of the somites, as you can see here. And the parapodia themselves have oblique muscles that are going to be important in moving the parapodia independent of the individual body somites. And this is going to be useful in crawling and defensive actions of staying in a burrow, and in some cases even swimming. They have a very complex centralized nervous system that is centered around a circumenteric neural ring. So this means that it's actually surrounding the digestive tract. This ring, on the dorsal aspect of it, it has a large cerebral ganglia or brain, and then it's also connected to this ventral nerve cord. And the ventral nerve cord has these individual ganglia in each somite from which lateral nerves are branching off to go to different structures in each somite. There are lots of neurological receptors in these animals. Many of them are mechanoreceptors. They are concentrated oftentimes at the base of the setae so that the setae have a very good feel for the environment that they're in. And we also see that there are staticists associated with these areas that help the body orient during movement or settlement. Photoreceptors are actually pretty common except in those species that are burrowers and don't really have any need for eyes. And these eyes have lenses in many cases when they're located in the head segment and even in the feeding tentacles of some of the feather duster worms and the tube dwellers that extend these tentacles out into the water column. There are also simpler photoreceptors that are basically just photosensory structures that can be distributed in other parts of the body as well. There are also chemosensory structures found across multiple somites throughout the body, basically, and some can be concentrated in the head too with those that have a greater cephalization. So here we can see a concentration of these sensory structures that are found just in the epithelium associated with each of the somites running the length of the body. Locomotion involves crawling or burrowing, and some can even swim, so a diversity of locomotion movements. Crawling itself can be accomplished in two basic patterns. So one is basically a side-to-side contraction, one side at a time, of the longitudinal muscles. And so what that does is, so for example, in this situation, the longitudinal muscles contract in this area. That causes the flexing of the body in this area. Then that, again, twists this animal. That would be followed by twisting of the body by the longitudinal muscles on this side contracting. And as they contract and meet an area, what they can do is attach their parapodia with the setae, and they use that to anchor to the substrate, and this allows the body to push forward. Another way of crawling is coordinated alteration of the circular and longitudinal muscles to basically change the shape of the individual somites. So think about these organisms which have these basically water balloons inside them. And here you can see that in this somite we've got this coelomic cavity that's separated by these mesenteries in the gut from this coelomic cavity on this side. And again, that would be also separated from individual pairs in each of the additional somites. If you had circular muscles, which are shown here, contract, that's going to squeeze this down and cause this somite to extend. So let me kind of try to draw that for you. This may not be pretty. So if we start off with a somite that's that shape, if we end up causing the circular muscles to contract, what it's going to do to the shape of this somite is it's going to make it extend like that, right? So the pressure associated with the circular muscles is going to cause it to pinch in like that. Well, then the next thing that would happen is the longitudinal muscles would pull this forward. So then the setae on this could extend and attach to the substrate, right, and grab hold of the substrate. Then the longitudinal muscle would contract, and that would form it back into this shape. But see, what it would do is it would drag it forward based off of that anchor. And so this coordinated movement of circular muscles and longitudinal muscles and circular muscles can allow the organism basically just to slowly crawl forward. Burrowing is basically accomplished in the same way as I just described. So the setae would brace the body against some substrate using their longitudinal muscles. So by contracting the longitudinal muscles, it makes them bigger around. That would contract the walls. Then those setae would attach, and then the body would then be pushed forward by a wave of circular muscles that would cause those somites to lengthen and push forward and allow them to burrow into the soil or sediment. Some of these marine worms can also swim quite agilely by very detailed control of undulating parts of their body itself, and then also some paddle-like movement of the individual parapodia. One final mode of locomotion in the terrestrial environment is the inchworm-like movements that we would see in something like a leech. So circular muscles would contract that would cause the body to extend, as we see here. Then the anterior sucker would attach to the substrate, and then the longitudinal muscles would contract, causing the body to shrink, pulling the posterior sucker back into place, which would then attach to a substrate, and then that would attach. And again, we would have circular muscles that would extend the body again, and it would just inch forward. There's a very diverse foraging series of mechanisms associated with how they get their food. Most Aurantia and some Sedentaria annelids are basically predators, and they're predators in pretty serious ways. They've got some pretty nasty jaws for capturing and subduing prey and drawing it back into the mouth using muscles that would be attached to these jaws to draw it into the body, where the food would be put into the pharynx, then the esophagus, and driven down the digestive tract. As far as predation methods, most of them are pretty mobile hunters, so they're errant again. They're crawling around looking for prey. However, some of the burrowers and some of the tube dwellers are basically hiding out in their burrows with their jaws ready to snap forward if they sense that prey is nearby, so they're sit-and-wait predators. Some of these worms, however, are deposit feeders, so they're basically just consuming sediment and filtering out the food particles that have fallen into this sediment. Earthworms are well known for doing this. They consume the sediment as they move through it, and they're very crucial in this way for turning over nutrients in an environment and enriching soils. Some other worms will live in burrows, and they'll actually draw water and sediment through their bodies and separate the food material from the non-food material. This worm right here is interesting. It's called a spaghetti worm. It actually has tentacles that stick out that are ciliated, and what they can do is capture food particles, and then cilia drives the food particles that are deposited in this sediment into the mouth. Many of the tube-dwelling worms, however, are suspension feeders, so they're filter feeders. They're cycling water through a series of tentacles, in many cases, as we can see in these feather duster worms, where we have cilia that are actually creating the water flow through these delicate tentacles, which are covered in mucus, and they capture suspended food particles, and then the cilia then also drives that food to the mouth. Many of the tube-dwelling worms can also be found in these U-shaped burrows, and they can capture suspended food particles by creating water flow into their mouth and then cycling it back out the back end of this burrow. Leeches are very specialized foragers. They're blood-sucking parasites, and they attach to their hosts using the anterior and posterior suckers, but they use 3 sharp jaws associated with their mouth for piercing the prey. Associated with these jaws also, they have salivary cells, glands, that secrete this anesthetic to keep the host from discovering that they're being fed on, and then also anticoagulants so that it prevents the blood flow from clotting, so it maintains blood flow so that they can continue to forage unheeded on their host. Annelids have a complete digestive tract with lots of specialized regions of organs for specialized functions. We generally break it up into 3 basic regions. The foregut includes the mouth here, going into the pharynx, and there can be jaws in some. In this situation, again, some of those are protrudable. Then that goes into the esophagus, and then into the crop, which is used for temporary storage of materials, and then the gizzard, which is used for grinding up that material. So a highly muscularized, grinding part of the esophagus. Moving past the foregut into the midgut, that's where we get into the stomach and the intestines. So this is all about the final digestion and absorption of materials. And remember, in intestines, the key to efficiency is high surface area and high vascularization. So as you can see in this cross-section of an earthworm, they have in their intestinal tract this extension sticking into the intestines called the typhlosola, which is also highly vascularized. So this just creates more vascular high surface area for more efficient uptake of the digested materials. The midgut in leeches is also greatly modified into this very large chamber for long-term storage of blood. And then the last section in an annelid's digestive tract is the hindgut, and this basically just contains the anus associated with that last pygidium section. Now, another really bizarrely and highly modified group of worms are called the beard worms. They used to even be put in their own clade. But now we know that they are just highly modified annelids. They live in the deep sea mud and some of these deep sea volcanic vent areas. They completely lack a functional digestive tract and instead rely on nutrients produced by symbiotic chemoautotrophic bacteria that they store in these tentacles that they stick out of the body. So they allow those bacteria to feed on chemicals, convert those chemicals into food sources that both the bacteria and the worms can use. Most annelids have a complete closed circulatory system. And this is because they need a good way to distribute gases and nutrients among these functionally isolated somites. So these somites really are separated. So an open circulatory system really wouldn't do a very good job. You have to be able to pierce those body septa with blood vessels to deliver the nutrients to each somite. Blood is moved through a series of these arches or enlarged pumping vessels, and then also blood can be moved simply through the movement of the body through muscular contractions. The main vessels include the vessels associated with the hearts that are circling the anterior part of the digestive tract. But then we see that there's a dorsal blood vessel that is moving the fluids forward, and then a ventral blood vessel that is pushing blood posteriorly. And so it makes this counterclockwise circuit. And we see that there are a number of smaller vessels that are attached to each of these, delivering nutrients and picking up nutrients, or waste products, I should say, at different stages. Respiration is accomplished in several ways. Again, these are fairly good animals as far as having a large surface area to volume ratio, so there's quite a bit of cutaneous respiration of the aquatic forms that stay wet, and even the terrestrial forms that are generally restricted to wet environments, moist soils. The parapodia themselves are large fleshy extensions that clearly are highly vascularized as well, so they also serve as respiratory surfaces. But most of the aquatic forms have gills or branchia. So these can be spread throughout the body, as you can see in this worm right here with these red frilly structures. You can also see gills associated with this spaghetti worm here. And then some of these deep sea species have been shown to be very tolerant of low oxygen levels, and so they don't even need much oxygen. As far as excretion, getting rid of nitrogenous waste, they have metanephridia. There are a pair of them in each somite. So here you can see one nephridium in this side, another nephridium in this side. So there's a pair in this one somite. The waste, the nephrostomes are picking up fluids from the coelomic cavity, and then the nephridiopores are opening onto the outside of the body, and that's where the nitrogenous wastes are going. Now, most of these species are osmoconformers, and so the metanephridia is more associated with getting rid of nitrogenous waste. But in some cases, osmotic regulation is more important. If you're going to be in a terrestrial environment, you don't want to get rid of your water. You want to have a way of conserving it. And if you're in a freshwater environment, you've really got to make sure you're producing dilute urine and you're really using your metanephridium to pump out excess water. But most of the marine forms are osmoconformers. So as I mentioned, the metanephridia are a key role in osmotic regulation in the freshwater and terrestrial forms, and those marine forms living near estuaries, for example, that do change in osmotic conformation regularly. But they also just have thick body walls to reduce the amount of osmotic movement across their epithelium, kind of like what we talked about the scales in fish can do. We're still talking about ectotherms in this group. As far as reproduction goes, we're back to a group of organisms, despite their complexity, because they're metameric, because each segment has the capability of doing most of the body functions, they still have clonal reproduction capacity via multiple fragmentation in many cases. But most reproduction is associated with sexual reproduction, and there are many examples of both monoecious and dioecious species, so that's highly variable. The gametes themselves are actually produced seasonally in the appropriate season as peritoneal cells, the mesodermal cells that line the coelomic cavity. Those actually produce the gametes themselves. Most of these are oviparous, so they're just releasing their gametes, and there's also associated with that typically external fertilization. And so we see broadcast of the gametes. And these gametes that are developed, again, in the coelomic cavity can be released into the outside environment through the nephrostome using the metanephridia, or in some cases, they grow to such a high pressure that the somite itself, the body wall of it, ruptures. This is particularly true in some species that specifically produce parts of their body that are reproductive somites. So some of these marine worms that do this, these reproductively capable body somites or metameres are called epitokes. The regular living part of the worm is called the atoke. So most of their life they'll be in the atoke form, but as the reproductive season comes, they will partition these epitoke regions into the production of sperm and eggs that will grow to such numbers that they break off from the atoke, they swim to the surface, and then they rupture, releasing their gametes. Now, when this occurs, this is highly synchronized within individual species, so that there's a lot of cross-fertilization between individuals and the gametes that they release. And in some Polynesian cultures, the timing of this has led to festivals in which they'll go out and actually gather these epitokes and use them as a big-time protein source, and have a big feast. Now, most of the earthworms and leeches are monoecious individuals, and they do copulate. So individuals has both testes and ovaries, and concentrated in specific somites in their anterior end, and they line up with each other such that they can have their male gonopores line up with the spermatheca, or their sperm storage vessels, of the other individual. And so each individual can transfer sperm from their male gonopores to the female spermatheca of the other individual. Now, one of the things that helps hold them together during this process is they secrete, as you can see here, this mucus sleeve, and that is actually produced by this structure called the clitellum. So the clitellum actually is this mucus producing structure that creates this sleeve that holds them together during mating, but it continues to have additional function. The clitellum also ends up producing this mucus sheath that rolls off the anterior part of the organism, capturing eggs that have been fertilized during this process using the sperm from the spermatheca that received from the other individual. They use those to fertilize eggs that are then deposited into this mucus sheath as it passes anteriorly. It slips off the body and forms this hard cocoon, in which the baby worms develop. And you notice that they're not developing as trochophore larvae in this situation. They're developing directly into little baby worms, so they show direct development. Development in general is spiral or modified spiral holoblastic cleavage. They are protostomes, so the blastophore becomes the mouth. In the aquatic forms, they do produce the free-swimming trochophore larva, but as I mentioned, there's direct development in the terrestrial forms. Larval forms are not going to work in a terrestrial environment. And as I mentioned, most of them are oviparous, but there are some annelids that are ovoviviparous and provide some basic parental care to increase the survivorship of their young early on. So they may brood their larvae internally or in tubes in some of the tube worms. The aquatic leeches will actually guard and ventilate their larvae during development in the cocoons that they produce. So there is some parental care. Lifespan, not a lot known, but they can regenerate lost or damaged parts of their bodies because of this metameristic lifestyle. And earthworms have been known to live up to 10 years, but not a huge lifespan. They do have a lot of different ways of defense. One is just crypsis, camouflage, blend into the environment, or behaviors associated with when you're active that reduces the chance that a predator is going to find you. But some actually go the opposite. So they show aposematic bright colorations, as we've seen in many other animal groups. This is also associated with the fact that they have toxins. So this right here is called a fireworm. Associated with these setae are glands that produce toxins, and so it's called the fireworm because if you touch it, it feels like your hand's on fire, or whatever tissue has been impaled by these setae. The burrowing forms can withdraw their tentacles into their tubes for protection if they're threatened. And sometimes if an animal tries to pull them out of their burrow, they can use their longitudinal muscles to crunch down, expand the size of their body so that they can wedge themselves into these tubes. And with the help of the setae, it makes it very difficult for an organism to pull them out of their burrows. There really isn't any true sociality in annelids. You can find them in clusters sometimes, like we see in these tube worms here, but no real true social behavior. As I mentioned, leeches are well known for being blood-sucking parasites. And so this is a form of symbiosis, a parasitic form, but they're not really very specific. They tend to be very generalist, attaching to any warm-blooded organism, or not even warm-blooded organism in some cases, to feed off the blood of that organism. So the leeches are parasite, but there are also some non-leech annelids, some other annelids that are also parasites of invertebrates and fish. There are also commensal relationships in or on other organisms shown with annelids. So here's one example of this. This is a sea star that's been turned upside down, and you see that there is an annelid worm here that basically lives in these ambulacral grooves and feeds on some of the food that's captured by the sea star. So it's a commensalism. This is called a scale worm. As I mentioned, the beard worms, those found at like the deep sea thermal vents, have mutualistic chemoautotrophic bacteria living internally in these tentacles or these ctenidia-like structures that are used for both foraging and exchanging of gases. It's mutualistic because they're providing the bacteria a place to live, but they're also paying rent by the chemoautotrophic actions of converting the sulfur and other compounds coming from these deep sea volcanic vents into food sources that the worms can eat. It turns out that one of the ways that they can resist these high temperatures at these vents is also by incorporation of other bacteria in a sheath around their body to provide basically a thermal buffer to the extreme heat. Annelids are really widespread in the marine, freshwater, and moist soil environments. A variety of lifestyles. There are many errant aquatic benthic surface dwellers where you have burrowers and soft sediments and hard structures. You can see here we have a tube worm that's actually embedded within this coral here. Some of the tube dwellers secrete a calcareous tube around them in which they live. Others produce these more flexible membranous structures, and then some actually in these more flexible structures will actually embed sand and shell and other bits of coral to provide these protective structures. Earthworms are terrestrial, but they are restricted to damp soil habitats. This is important because they have to keep their mucus-covered epithelium moist because it's in large part responsible for their gas exchange. You will, however, see earthworms come to the surface in two basic situations. They come out at night when there's less evaporative stress, so the higher humidity, the sun isn't likely to dry them out, and so they can come to the surface temporarily. Or after a big rain, you may notice they'll come out into sidewalks and on the road. That's because if the soil is really saturated with water, remember in air there's a much greater concentration of oxygen than in water, and so they're coming up in these wet times to take advantage of that higher oxygen concentration in air. Annelids appear to be relatively tolerant to increases in ocean acidification and temperature associated with those living in those habitats. Studies indicate that some do have quite a bit of genetic diversity, and that genetic diversity is allowing some of these populations to adapt to these changing environments. As far as the terrestrial earthworms go, as climate change occurs, however, as we start to see desertification or the drying of certain environments, say grassland environments becoming more and more desert-like, that is going to have a negative impact on those organisms, and that's going to drastically affect those ecosystems because earthworms are so very important in turning over nutrients in the soil in those environments. So in review, we talked about the annelid worms, represented by two main clades, the Aurantia and the Sedentaria. They're bilaterally triploblastic eucoelomates. They vary in cephalization depending upon their movement patterns or sedentary patterns. They're called the segmented worms because they have this segmented body or metamerism where they have individual somites or metameres. Two important synapomorphies are these body bristles or setae, some of which are attached to parapodia, and the parapodia have a locomotion function but also serve in respiration. They don't have any skeletal support behind hydrostatic support, but they do have very well-developed muscular systems and nervous systems with a ventral nerve cord. Some are very mobile, and these are the ones with greater cephalization. Highly variable foraging modes. Most of them are predators, but we have a lot of deposit feeders and filter feeders. They do have a complete digestive tract with a high degree of organ specialization going down this tract. They have a closed circulatory system, which is needed to efficiently move nutrients and waste products throughout their body among these individually isolated somites. They have a variety of means of respiration, so cutaneous respiration is seen in many. Parapodia help with that, and many of the aquatic forms have gills. As far as excretion, the metanephridia are very important for that, and the metanephridia are also used in some cases for osmoregulation, but that really depends. That's going to be more important in the freshwater forms and the terrestrial forms. And one other thing, the metanephridia are also important in reproduction because they serve as a release for the gametes in many of these organisms. As far as reproduction goes, fragmentation is possible in some. And as far as sexual reproduction goes, there's a variety of ways species are put together as far as being either monoecious or dioecious. Most of them are oviparous with external fertilization, and the gametes have to get together and take care of themselves once zygotes are formed. They end up producing a trochophore larva. In some forms, the gametes are released by bursting of specialized somites called epitokes that swim to the surface and are highly synchronized in their reproductive seasonality. Many of the earthworms and leeches are monoecious, and they come together to swap sperm and have internal fertilization, where the fertilized eggs then are put into this mucus sleeve created by the clitellum that forms a cocoon to allow them to develop. They're protostomes. That means they've got spiral holoblastic cleavage, and the blastopore comes to the mouth. There is a trochophore larva in the aquatic forms, but we do see direct development in the terrestrial forms. Talked about a variety of defense mechanisms going from being cryptic to aposematic and potentially dangerous, but they don't really have very long lifespans, and there really isn't any sociality, but they do show a number of symbiotic relationships, including commensalism and quite a few parasitic forms, and some mutualisms. widespread use of habitats, which wouldn't be surprising given how many species there are and the morphological diversity that we've talked about. And climate change effects may not be too large, at least in the aquatic environment, but I do want you to add to this that in the terrestrial environment, as environment soils dry, that is going to have a major impact on earthworm populations.